Okay, we're talking about Indian removal, but I want to make an important point in the beginning here, which is that regardless of what you are studying in American history prior to the Civil War, you should always be thinking, how is what I am studying leading to the Civil War? And that's a little bit dangerous because you don't want to, constantly read things into events that aren't there. But this is my way of saying that chances are there is something there. In other words, uh, in the antebellum years, certainly, when we're in this period that we're in now, the 1820s and 1830s, but really even earlier, certainly going all the way back to, that first slave ship pulling up to the James River to Jamestown in 1618 or so, is that the issue of slavery, the arguments over slavery, the expansion of slavery, these are things that should be on our radar. And absolutely, Indian removal is all about the expansion of slavery, really. People want Indians out of the way in Georgia, in part so that they can do what a number of the Indians had been doing in Georgia, which was growing crops for a market economy with the use of slaves. So I just want to say that right from the start because the process of removing Indians is part and parcel to the process of dealing with getting the other out of the way, right? I mean, in the 1820s, you get this big movement with the American Colonization Society to move free blacks, former slaves, to Liberia in Africa at the same time that you're talking about removing Indians to Indian Territory in what is going to become Oklahoma. So there is that people want to remove, that white people want to remove non-whites from their social space, from the landscape. Um, but it's also that there's an economic opportunity that comes with certainly the removal of Indians. And so they were big landowners in a way that, of course, the slaves were not. So by the time we get to Jacksonian America, um, obviously Americans or Europeans, Euro Americans, white people, and Native Americans have been going at it for a really long time in North America. We have all these wars and the signing over of land, which ultimately is leading to Indians being pushed west. Um, I said earlier, we talked about this sort of thing that's hard to figure out with Andrew Jackson wanting to remove um, Native people against the resistance of the federal law as ruled in the Supreme Court case that we're going to talk about here in more detail with Worcester versus Georgia, uh, and how that is counterintuitive or counter to this idea that or that it makes sense that Jackson is a pro-states guy, anti-federal government, that he wants to resist federal government, but then with the nullification crisis, he defends federal government. I found this quotation I wanted to share with you. April of 1830, Andrew Jackson was making a toast uh, in the White House. Calhoun was in the room. This was at a dinner. This was as the nullification crisis was cranking up. Jackson said, "To our federal union, it must be preserved." And Calhoun replied, "To the union, next to our liberty, most dear." Um, these tensions between Calhoun and Jackson, as I said in class, the politics of the personal and is very important here, and that Jackson and Calhoun didn't like each other for various reasons. Anyway, we the Cherokee were very acculturated, um, and we talked about how they fought with Jackson at Horseshoe Bend, and they made these different decisions at different times in their history to fight, with the British, for example, in the Revolutionary War, which is ultimately a bad decision. They fought with Jackson in the War of 1812 at Horseshoe Bend. It didn't help them any. There's a lot of intermarriage among the Cherokee. So this idea that that they're going to show that they're civilized. You see the IDs here. That they're going to show that they're civilized. Uh, they were, and it didn't matter ultimately. Here we see these images of the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, where part of a column would be written in the written form of the Cherokee language, which they developed around this period, famously by this Native American, or this Cherokee named Sequoyah, who was from Tennessee, up around between here and Knoxville. But they established their own nation. They have their own constitution. You can see here on this issue, Volume 1, from early in 1828, you can see they've published the Constitution of the Cherokee Nation. And I point out here that numerous historians have noted that the most threatening thing ultimately about the Cherokee to a lot of people was, in fact, that they were so assimilated. So, we could ask, why that might have been the case. Why would it have been so threatening that they were assimilated, that they were educated, that they had a newspaper, they had a constitution, they had their own legislature? Well, for starters, they own a lot of land. And if people want their land and see opportunity there for that, well, then obviously if they're assimilated and are considered to be part of society, whether they're their own nation or not, they're on this landscape, that's a problem. They're in the way. The other thing is, what if all the other Indian tribes across the nation start to make this argument that they are their own nation within the nation? Then you're going to have a lot of land that is locked up. And remember, by 1827, 1828, a lot of Native people had already moved to Indian Territory, to Oklahoma, including a lot of Cherokee. We talked about Jackson's inaugural, and which happens right after this, and he's elected in 1828. He comes in office in 1829. He said these two important things. He praised the idea of state militias, and then he said that essentially what the American people want, they will get as regarding Indians. So that the feelings of the people would dictate Indian policy. And meanwhile, also, again, as a reminder, gold is discovered on Cherokee land in around 1829, this 29er gold rush, which further compounds the pressure on the Cherokee, because now Georgians are becoming even more greedy and physically violent, sending in land surveyors to plot out Cherokee lands to be sold to settlers. And in addition, Georgians are clamoring in Congress for the removal of Indians from good farming and mining land, which had been going on for a while, so that their own brand of civilization, of this, the Georgians, a civilization without Indians in the picture, could proceed. So Congress passes in 1830 the Indian Removal Act, which you should recall said that the government could negotiate treaties with Indian people with the goal of moving them west beyond the Mississippi. And then it allocated money for the president and the federal government to negotiate those treaties. And, it's at this point that the Cherokee in Georgia say, fighting back with violence is useless. And that's when, in an action that shows exactly how acculturated they were, they go out and hire in 1831 one of the most famous attorneys in America, a guy named William Wirt, who had been the prosecutor in Aaron Burr's treason trial. And in fact, I think had run for president at one time. He was very famous. And they sue with Wirt, they sue the state of Georgia in an attempt to say, you can't tell us what to do because we're our own nation. And we can negotiate with the federal government if and when we choose to do so, just like England or France could negotiate something with the United States. We're a separate nation. And this is the case of Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia. And again, who's the Supreme Court Justice? John Marshall, who had fought with George Washington in the Revolutionary War and is the first great justice of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says that the Cherokee, they ruled that the Cherokee are not technically a foreign nation, but what they call a domestic dependent nation. And it's convoluted, but hang with me. They say that they can't therefore sue the state of Georgia. Now, meanwhile, in another case, the very next year, in Worcester versus Georgia, which is 1832, this was the case in which a missionary sued, saying that Georgia could not tell him. Georgia passed a law that said that whites couldn't live among the Cherokee. And Worcester sued and said that you can't tell me what to do because I'm working within a separate nation. And the laws of Georgia don't apply here. And in this case, the court said, and I quote, the Cherokee Nation is a distinct community, occupying its own territory with boundaries accurately described in which the laws of Georgia have no force. I'm trying to be, obviously, a little bit funny here. You see Worcester on the right, and you see the musician Beck on the left. When I saw this picture of Worcester, I thought, my God, he looks exactly like Beck. Lost at birth. Who knows? It's a great mystery. But Worcester, this is a famous case, Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, because this is the law that actually establishes the idea, in fact, that, okay, so if they're a domestic dependent nation, whatever that means, they're a separate nation. This is why, to this day, Native American reservations can have casinos and you know, can sell tobacco that's not taxed and things like that, because they are a separate nation within Oklahoma or North Carolina or where have you, Florida, where have you. By the way, Steve Inskeep, who wrote this book, Jackson Land, made a great point in talking about the Cherokee and these lawsuits, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and then Worcester versus Georgia. He said, and I quote, the Cherokee were more than mere victims. They were skilled political operators who played a bad hand long and well. Meaning, they fought this thing as well as they could for as long as they could. We'll see ultimately that they lose their land in Georgia. Worcester, by the way, he wins this case, but he stays in jail. Georgia doesn't release him. Um, he's in jail down in Milledgeville, Georgia, in the state prison, where prisoners that he's imprisoned with are put to work making lottery wheels for, that they'll use in parceling out the Cherokee land. They literally had a lottery to see who would get which parcels. Anyway, here's the important lesson um, regarding the Cherokee and their eventual removal. As I've already stated, the state of Georgia ignored the Supreme Court, and the president. Here you see Andrew Jackson. This is a cartoon where it's very much satire. King Andrew. You see Lady Liberty up in the painting in the background, just stomping uh, someone to death. We might assume that is someone who maybe Worcester, maybe William Wirt, the attorney, someone who's trying to fight for the liberty of the Indian people. And this is satire in that King Andrew is supposedly this paternalistic. He Remini argued that, of course, that Jackson had this humanitarian impulse that he wanted to take care of Indians. And people at the time knew that was an argument that Jackson himself used at the time. Look, they're going to get slaughtered if we don't send them safely to Oklahoma. But people also realized that Jackson could have done something to protect them in Georgia, which was the right thing to do. But these are like, the Indians are these little bitty people, these little children, kind of almost playthings. But Jackson does nothing to support the Supreme Court's decision. And again, Worcester and this other missionary stayed in jail. One historian wrote, Georgia continued its campaign to undermine Cherokee government. Many Cherokees and their supporters came to believe that in their Supreme Court victory, they had, in fact, lost their battle. And indeed, they had. By 1935, the federal government had decided that the Cherokee remaining in the East needed to go to Indian Territory. So the government announced that the Cherokee Council, the governing body, needed to meet at New Echota in Georgia, which is just south of Chattanooga, around Dalton, to negotiate a treaty. And when they announced this, the government said New Echota was the capital of the Cherokee Nation. And anyway, when they announced this, the government said that for any Cherokee not in attendance, the assumption would be that they were in agreement with any treaty that got signed. And then the treaty commissioners had many of the principal leaders jailed with no charges. And they suppressed the production of the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper so that no one can really have word that there's going to be this new treaty. And then with less than a quarter of the tribal leadership in attendance, the Treaty of New Echota was signed. John Ross was in D.C. at the time. This Cherokee named Major Ridge claimed that he was the leader in charge. He signed. We'll see what happens to him later. But the treaty said that the United States would pay the Cherokee $5 million for their lands east of the Mississippi, and that they would be relocated to Indian Territory in a removal that would be financed by the federal government. And that the federal government would also provide the Cherokee subsistence for 1 year after their arrival in the West. So the Cherokee leaders who had been jailed immediately complained to Washington. They signed all these petitions that showed basically that 80% of the tribe denounced the treaty and the illegal nature of the whole process, which they rightly saw as a complete sham. But as another historian wrote concerning the treaty, and I quote, the Senate ratified it, and President Andrew Jackson declared that the treaty would be executed as written, that no Cherokee council would be permitted to discuss the treaty, and that no further communication would be held with the now extinct Eastern Cherokee Nation. I continue to quote here. Accordingly, during the next 3 years, the Cherokee were first individually and then in mass evicted from their homes and herded west over the infamous Trail of Tears. And then this historian who wrote this said, the Treaty of New Echota is considered to be one of the most reprehensible treaties in U.S. history. Again, when any historian says that something is the most of whatever, it's worth listening to, whether you can argue or not. You should listen to it and then, develop your argument. I have a hard time arguing against this on one level, that the Treaty of New Echota is considered to be one of the most reprehensible treaties in U.S. history. Sadly, though, I can think of a handful of other treaties with Native American tribes that we'll look at later in the 19th century, which are just as bad. And as we'll see as we continue to read about this, the removal was an immensely brutal event. And some Cherokee, of course, resisted. They refused to move west. They retreated into the mountains of North Carolina. And this, of course, running away is a strategy that's employed by a lot of Indian people at different times. And it's always a good strategy for anybody resisting anything is to run, especially if you can actually get away, which many Cherokee did, and that's why we have two official Cherokee nations in the United States now, or tribes in the United States. One is in Oklahoma, and one is in North Carolina, and they're pretty well joined back together now, but they're sort of two political entities, two different ones. Anyway, I'm going to come back to the Cherokee here, but I want to return here. I want to talk about the Seminole again, just briefly. And we've talked about in class the Seminole Wars, the fact that the Seminole were these people who were, kind of a bunch of different groups who had been in Florida. Some of the group, ancestrally had been there since the Spanish arrived, but then you get all these other people who are pushed into Florida. You get these runaway slaves who join with the Seminole over time. Osceola, who we see here, he was a Creek. I mean, his parents were literally, ran from. In fact, maybe one of his parents died at Horseshoe Bend, but he was, as a youngster, ran into Florida, basically retreated into Florida after Jackson's defeat of the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend. And so I want to just say something here real quickly about the kind of agenda at play here. I mean, clearly, someone like Jackson and other Americans are, as we've said, concerned that there's this place south of the South, right? That south of the Deep South Plantation South in Florida, that is a haven for runaways and for slaves and Indians. And so it's this problem that in 1817, 1818, you get the first Seminole Wars. They extend all the way through really the 1850s. And then Osceola's story and all of this happens around 1835, around the time of the Treaty of New Echota up north of Florida. And um, Osceola, looks relatively benign in this picture, but he was really very tough and even kind of a ruthless warrior. And on at least one occasion, he killed an Indian chief who had agreed to immigrate to Indian Territory. He was very resistant. Um, and um, another time, he appeared at a fort where a bunch of other natives who had decided to go off to Indian territory had gathered, and Osceola attacked and killed some of them. So the Americans decided that they needed to get Osceola out of the picture, and any way possible. So in 1837, in a battle, his group waved a flag of truce, which didn't say we're surrendering. It said, let's stop and have a council to talk. And once they were at this meeting spot under a flag of truce, not a flag of surrender, but kind of a temporary respite from fighting, the Americans took Osceola hostage and put him in a prison in Florida, and then eventually they sent him to Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, on Sullivan's Island, this barrier island off of the coast of Charleston that we've talked about as the uh, the, the, the place where so many enslaved Africans and Caribbean African Americans from other parts of the South who were coming into South Carolina, slaves, were quarantined. We've talked about this. But Osceola was not there very long, and he died. They think he possibly died from tonsillitis, of all things. But I wanted to just show you this and have this caption. I showed this picture earlier. You can see my bicycle down here that I rode over here to Fort Moultrie, and this is Osceola's grave. It's just the weirdest thing. There's this one grave there, that this fort that was the quarantine spot for slaves. It was a major fort in a fort in the Revolution. We talked about, the palmetto logs and the cannonballs bouncing off of them, the Revolutionary battles. Then it's a Civil War fort, and then it fits into this whole story of Indian removal. And I say here that Osceola could have seen, as he was being brought into Fort Moultrie, he very likely saw Fort Sumter, which was under construction out in the harbor. In this period. And so it's a reminder of what I said at the very beginning of this, which is that, moving Indians out of the way, just this place reminds us of this, that moving Indians out of the way is key to the success of expansion. And certainly in the South, in the land of the Creek and the Seminole, and in the case of Osceola, a Seminole, he was really born a Creek. But in the land of the Cherokee and the Choctaw, these are the lands where slavocracy is going to expand in the 18 teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s, with the expansion of the cotton lands across the deep South. So there's a connection here, and it's just odd that it's so visible, with Osceola being buried right there within a matter of yards from the place where all these slaves were quarantined. So the connection between Indian removal and the growth of slavery is hard to miss. And at the time, in the 19th century, abolitionists at the time rightly saw Indian removal and slavery as intimately linked. And historians have talked about how so many, there were these organized chain letters that women would write and pass around, for example. Women like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was very against Indian removal and is later against the expansion of slavery. That they're involved in this, that they knew, that the activists knew what was happening here. That you got to get the Indians out of the way to expand slavery, and people who are against slavery see the connection and they are against this. Steve Inskeep said this. He said, Indian removal was rapidly becoming a template for another greater conflict between the North and the South. And he talked about how abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison, who you'll hear about later, said that they connected these two moral issues as being basically the same issue. So to finish up here real quickly, the like the Cherokee, most of the Seminoles ended up going to Indian Territory. You see this red line here coming out of Florida. Indian removal is not just about the Cherokee, who roughly followed this blue line here, a couple different routes from Georgia and Tennessee to Oklahoma. But you see the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Choctaw, all these groups that were moved out of the Deep South in this period. Some of the Seminole escaped into the Everglades, where they, continued to fight and lash out for decades to come. And in this war, the Seminole War has become this very, very expensive war where lots of American soldiers die. Anyway, the Seminoles survived, and some Cherokee survived in the hiding out in the mountains of North Carolina. In retrospect, looking at what happened, it kind of makes you wonder if fighting it out, I don't know, it might have been a pretty decent option for some Indians. It certainly ended up being a decent option for the Seminole, who were able to stay in Florida. But when you consider what happened, certainly on the Trail of Tears, where so many people died, fighting it out, some people certainly probably regretted that they had not. 13,000 Cherokee began the journey, and 4,000 of them died. Of one group of 1,000 Choctaw immigrants, only 88 made it to Indian Territory. And then when the various groups made it, and here you see a little more detailed map that shows these various names. Right, a number of the people who went on rivers as far as they could go, on boats. But when these various groups made it to Indian Territory, they found a different type of landscape, and they very often found other Indian groups living where they were supposed to settle. So even in their worst hour upon arrival in a compartmentalized Indian country, where the U.S. had successfully herded many of its unwanted together into one place, various people were met with kind of new indignities, I guess you could say, as they found that Indian Territory was a relatively